Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Salma Nusair. I'm a third year medical student and I'm going to be walking you guys through the cardiac and smooth muscle electrophysiology, inshallah. Now, for starters, this session we split it into two halves. Cardiac today and smooth will be recorded and uploaded tomorrow, inshallah. But for now, we're just going to jump straight into cardiac questions. If throughout the lecture you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me. However, when we are answering questions, just put them in the chat box to give everyone a chance to answer, then we can discuss them. Okay? Yalla. Firstly, let's begin with the structure. When you want to describe the structure of a cardiac cell, how would you describe it? Here's a picture. Unstriated or striated? Striated. Exactly. Striated, branching, has discs. Do you remember the name of these discs? Intercalated discs. Exactly. How would you describe the nuclei? Are they central? Are they peripheral? Do you have multiple per cell? Is it one per cell? Central? Yes, exactly. So you have a single central nucleus per cell, and you have intercalated discs, which are a hallmark in cardiac cells, and you have striations. This is another picture. You can see here the central nucleus, the striations, and the intercalated disc. Now, do you guys remember what sarcomeres were? Like, just by looking at this picture, do you know what you're looking at? Z to Z? Yes. Yes, they are what cause the striations. Essentially, your short filament is your actin and your thick filament is your myosin. This is a silly way that I used to remember in first year. Actin is active, so it's thin. If it works for you, it works. If not, then I don't know, you can come up with another mnemonic. But basically, the way it works, this is not the most anatomically accurate way, but basically, you're gonna have a head over here. Your myosin head's gonna bind to the binding site on the actin. Same thing here, same thing here, same thing here, all over. So in this current shape and form, how many connections can you form? Each one of these being a connection. 12, exactly. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, what if we compressed our sarcomere and it looked a bit more like this? So this one would bind here, this one here, this one here, this one would have nothing, this over here, like that, I guess. How many connections would you have? 7. Okay. Now, which one do you think would be stronger? This one or that one? The one with 7 connections per se, they're not actually like connections, or the one with 12? Exactly, the one with 12. So this is where Frank Starling's law comes in, where if you fill in the heart more, meaning you stretch it more, you're going to have a stronger contraction. Okay? Because once you get to this state, this is called optimal stretch, you're going to get the strongest contraction. Does that make sense? Yes, okay. Now, obviously, everything has a limit. So if you overstretch your sarcomere, you're going to end up with this, where basically you're going to have just these connections. And how many are these? They're 8. So basically, the more you stretch the heart, the stronger the force of contraction, but to an extent. So if we were to put it in a graph, our graph would look a bit like this. If we put tension against stretch, it would look a bit like this. And these are where they fall on the graph. Do you guys get why each of these falls in their respective place? Which part do you not understand? It's okay. Basically, for now, I'm just gonna explain the graph real quick and then I'm gonna go back. The further to the right you go, so along the x-axis, the more you stretch the muscle. So up, right there, the muscle is compressed. And then as you go more to the right, you're expanding it more, you're stretching it more. And then once you get to the far end, you're stretching it too much. Okay, that's the graph. But if we were to go back to the actual sarcomere things, the whole way that if you remember in the skeletal muscle, do you remember in the skeletal muscle how actin myosin contraction happens? If you don't, I can explain it real quick. It's fine. Basically, long story short, you have calcium binds to troponin C that exposes the binding spots, and then you're going to have myosin heads binding to the actin binding spots. Or you're just going to have binding between the actin and the myosin. Okay? And then this, they're gonna bind, and then one of them is gonna pull, the myosin's gonna pull, and that's gonna cause the stretch. Does that make sense? Okay. Basically, you need as many, like, the more pulley forces, the more binding spots you have, the stronger the force of contraction. So if you had just two attachments that are pulling, it's obviously going to be a weak contraction. However, if you have, say, 4 or 5 or even 10 binding spots, you're going to have a stronger contraction. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. So basically, this is what we call optimal stretch, where you have enough space for each of the like myosin heads and actin like binding spots to bind together. Okay, if you compress them, basically your actin filaments are overlapping. So these 4 heads, 4 binding spots, 1, 2, 3, 4, are basically gone to waste because you can't really bind anything, especially on these on the outside. Okay, same thing here. On the ones on the outside, you cannot bind the myosin heads. Does that make sense? Okay. However, if you overstretch it, what's going to happen is, you're welcome. What's going to happen is the binding spots are too far away for the myosin heads to reach. Okay? Does that make sense so far? Okay. Alhamdulillah. If you guys have any questions regarding this or any other part, once again, feel free. Okay, I will repeat. If it's compressed, if it's too compressed, think of it like Velcro. Okay? Let's say this is the sticky part on both sides. Okay? These two need to stick. And then if I pull like this, it's going to be a strong contraction. Okay? If I overstretched it, then the point of contact is just the tips of my fingers. Okay? So this would be a much weaker contraction force. Does that make sense? This is optimal and this is overstretched. Does that make sense so far? Yes. Okay. Now, if it's compressed, let's say that the only like Velcro part is my fingers right here. Up to here is not Velcro. So if I were to compress them, then this part is not Velcro. So they are not sticking together. They're not binding. So this overlap is useless. This contact is useless. So once again, the only actual useful part is the very spot in the middle, like right here. Okay? This is if you compress it. So rather than having all 4 parts of my fingers being contact areas where you're going to get a contraction, it's just a very small part. Does that make sense? Okay, no worries. Does everyone understand why each of these is in its respective place in the graph? Okay, alhamdulillah. Now, like we said, this area is the optimal one. However, in the heart in specific, your cardiac cells, the resting place is like the resting state is not optimal. So for you to reach the optimal state, you need to stretch the muscles. How do you stretch your cardiac muscles? You fill them up. This is your Frank-Starling law, where with the greater you fill in the ventricles during diastole, because as you know, the ventricles fill in during diastole, which is when they're relaxed, not during systole when they're contracted. Okay? The more they're stretched and the stronger the contraction. Does that make sense? Okay, alhamdulillah. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard this before, but cardiac cells are considered a functional syncytium. Do you know what that means? Okay, yeah, function as one unit. Syncytium just means one unit. Functional means they function as a one unit. Okay, this is it. You have multiple cells and they work together as if they're one cell or they're one unit. Okay, how does a cell do that? When they contract all together as if they're one cell. Yes, technically they are in sync. That's right. They do that through connections. You have your intercalated discs and your gap junctions. This right here is more of an anatomically accurate diagram, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to explain it on a much simpler diagram. Let's say we have 2 cells that are right next to each other, okay? And you have another 2 cells that are below it. And then you obviously have striations. What causes the striations? Exactly, your sarcomeres. So you have your sarcomere over here and your sarcomere over there. And then perpendicular, or in other words, yes, exactly. So perpendicular to your striations, or in other words, transverse to your striations, you have intercalated discs. So this right here is an intercalated disc, and this right here is an intercalated disc. Okay, as you can see, this one sarcomere extends from one cell to another. So if this entire thing was to contract, then both cells would contract together. Essentially like this. Does that make sense? Okay, so intercalated discs are basically mechanical connections between cells to allow them to contract as quote unquote one unit, as a functional syncytium. The intercalated disc is for fast communication. It's no, more so it's for like it's a mechanical connection between the two cells. Like as you can see here, the single sarcomere goes over both cells. So in this singular sarcomere, yeah, essentially, it's a complex connection. We don't need to go into the details. Just know that it allows for like both cells to contract together. Okay? Okay. And then parallel to is an intercalated cell between each sarcomere. Each sarcomere is your Z disc or Z line, this one right here. Your intercalated discs, if you look here, they're in between the cells. Okay? And then on the lateral aspect, so more essentially like parallel essentially to your sarcomeres, you have gap junctions. Wait, does the intercalated disc make sense so far? Yes, okay. And then I was saying on the lateral aspect of your cell, you have what's called a gap junction. As you know, when the cell contracts, you need ions for depolarization, you need ions for the actual contraction itself, you need a bunch of things. So these ions can actually travel from the cell to the other one. So they travel from the upper cells to the lower ones through your gap junctions. Okay? And this allows the lower cells to contract as well. This is how these four cells work as a functional syncytium. Does that make sense so far? Okay, alhamdulillah. Any questions? No. Okay, moving on. I want you guys, how, what questions on this come? What were the blue dots? The blue dots, I'll come back to the questions one. The blue dots were essentially, think of them as calcium, think of them as sodium, just ions, anything that causes a depolarization or a contraction. Okay? Okay. Now I want you guys to try and solve this. Questions on this would probably, I have no idea how Dr. Angelica would ask them, but I know she has a bunch of questions on her on Moodle. So definitely try to solve these and see how her style of questions is. No worries. Okay. I want you guys to try and answer this and then we'll discuss it, inshallah. Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of E's and you're all correct, mashallah. But I want you guys to tell me why each of the options are incorrect as well, because it's the best way. This is how you make the most of a practice question. You want to rule out all of the other options. Why is A wrong? Or in other words, where would you see actin filaments overlapping each other? Down, yeah, technically at rest, when there is no room. Exactly, you're all correct. Essentially, or according like visually, it's this state. As you can see, the actin filaments are overlapping, and that's not good for contraction. B was myosin filaments are overlapping. Honestly, I have no idea how myosin filaments could possibly overlap. I didn't get the question. What does the graph represent? On the x-axis, you have stretch. On the y-axis, you have tension. So the further to the right you go, the more stretched the cell is. And the further up you go, the stronger the force. So essentially, this is showing you that the more you stretch the cell, the stronger the force of contraction. However, you get to a point, which is after point C, where overstretching the cell does more harm than good. Does that make sense? So is it A? Yeah, A technically would be this part, where the cell is too compressed and the actin filaments are overlapping. Make sense? Okay. Myosin filaments are at its minimum length. The length doesn't really change according to stretch. The Z discs of the sarcomeres are about the ends of the myosin filament. They're always at the ends of the myosin filament. There's optimal overlap. Yeah, we did this. There's minimal overlap. Minimal overlap is seen in which point? D. Exactly. Okay. Now, as you guys all know, the conduction through the heart is an electrical current. But then, of course, the current has to travel in a specific order. Do you guys know how the current travels, specifically in your heart? Where does it start? Let's start there. Where in your heart does the electric current start? Exactly, in your SA node. Your SA node is what's called a pacemaker. It's a cell that can fire on its own. Okay? It's gonna go from your SA node to, and then the second pacemaker is your AV node. Okay? So your SA node is gonna fire and it's gonna depolarize your atria, both your right atrium and your left atrium, and it's gonna depolarize your AV node. Okay? Basically, the SA node we said is a pacemaker. It has automaticity, which means it can fire on its own. It doesn't need an external stimulus. It's self-sufficient and it can fire on its own. Okay? It's gonna depolarize the atria. It's gonna depolarize the AV node. The atria are gonna contract, but in the AV node, it's gonna pause. It's gonna pause for a bit. It's gonna slow down. Then it's gonna go from the AV node to the bundle of His. Now, the bundle of His is the connection between your atria and your ventricles. And then, one second. Sorry, guys. Okay, sorry about that. Your bundle of His is the connection between your atria and your ventricles. Okay, and then from the bundle of His, it's going to split into two, your bundle branches. And from your bundle branches, it's going to go up the Purkinje fibers. Once it goes up the Purkinje fibers, all of the ventricles are going to depolarize. Okay, does that make sense? Yes. So SA node, AV node, pause, bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. That's the entire thing. But then I have a question for you guys. Why do we pause in the AV? Why is there an AV delay? To allow the heart to fill. Okay, could you further expand? Could you tell me how this allows the heart to fill? Okay, exactly. Basically, the way the whole thing works, this is an electric current, so it's really, really fast. So if there was no delay, it would just be the atria contracting and the ventricles contracting right away. Okay, if there was no pause, the ventricles would not have time to fill up, and it would just be like a contraction with no blood leaving the heart. However, if the atrium contracts while the ventricle is still relaxed, it's going to have time to fill up, and then once it's done filling up, it's going to contract and release the blood. Okay? Does that make sense? The whole point of AV delay is to give time for the ventricles to fill up before they contract. So good so far? Yeah, so far so good? Okay. Now, I've been saying action potential, I've been saying depolarization. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. I sure hope so. But we're going to further expand on it. Over here, I have a very, I think, inaccurate, anatomically inaccurate representation of the cell. And as you know, outside the cell, you have more potassium. Inside the cell, like outside the cell, like compared outside to inside, you have more potassium outside the cell than inside. You have more sodium and more calcium inside the cell than outside. Okay? And then membrane potential is basically a relative difference between the outside and the inside. Basically, if you have more positive ions inside the cell than outside, then that's a positive membrane potential. If you have more positive ions outside than inside, then that's a negative membrane potential. What do you mean the opposite? No, you have more potassium outside. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it's more potassium outside, but I can check in a bit. Either way, this isn't really relevant right now. We're going to talk about the exchange of currents. Okay? I'll check it in a bit. But for now, just forget this. We're just gonna skip it and go on to the actual movement of ions. Okay? Okay. Now, at rest, your cells at rest, you're going to have a sodium-potassium pump called NAK ATPase. It's going to pump, and I think the heart is opposite to the neurons. Wallahi, I'm not sure. I'm not going to say something I'm not sure of, so I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to skip this part, and we're going to come back to it later, inshallah. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the ion exchange. Okay? Okay. Now, as I was saying, in your heart, you have a sodium-potassium pump, which is going to pump 3 sodiums outside and 2 potassiums inside. Okay? And then you're going to also have a leaky current, which is going to push potassium outside. So what's this going to do? How's this going to affect your membrane potential? Is the cell more positive or more negative? Exactly, it's negative. So your resting potential lies somewhere around here. Okay, now I don't know if you guys know this, but one thing about the sodium potassium pump, the way you can memorize it is Nokia 321. Okay, Nokia, sodium out, Ki, K, potassium in, 3Na, 2, 2K, and then A1, 1 ATP. So basically, your NAK ATPase is going to push 3 sodium particles, 3 sodium ions outside, and pull 2 potassium ions inside in exchange for 1 ATP. Okay, this is an easy way you can memorize what the sodium ATPase does, or the sodium potassium ATPase does. And this is our resting potential. It's at around negative 90 millivolts. Let's say you get a stimulus and you reach threshold. What's going to happen at threshold? Your fast NA channels are going to open, and that's going to allow a really rapid rush of sodium inside the cell. What's this going to cause? This is going to cause a more positive membrane potential, a more negative one. What's this going to do? A more positive one, exactly. So is it going to go up in the graph or down? Up. And we call this a depolarization. So this is what's going to happen. One thing I want to say is this is a really, really fast channel. Like you can see this line is almost perpendicular because the sodium rushes so fast to the inside and it just changes with the potential really fast. Okay? Now, once we get to this point, our NA channel is going to not only close, but it's going to also inactivate. So whatever you do, this channel is not going to open until you go back to a negative membrane potential. Okay, so our fast NA channels are now inactivated and closed. What's going to happen now is you're going to have your ITO, or your transient potassium channels, are going to open, and the potassium is going to go outside for a really short period of time. What's this rush out of potassium going to cause? Yes, depolarization is when it gets positive through sodium channels. Yes, exactly. This is going to cause the cell to become more negative. So is it going to go up or down? Down. And is this called depolarization or repolarization? Repolarization. We don't call this hyperpolarization just yet. Hyperpolarization is when it goes below resting. Okay, this is just called repolarization. One thing I want to note is this is called the transient outside potassium, essentially ITO, because it opens for a really and closes for such a short period of time. And this is it. It just opens, lets out a bit of potassium, and then closes. That's how it works. Okay? No, wait, how? Which part? Isn't Na a positive ion? It is a positive ion. It's K positive. Potassium is a positive cell, is a positive ion. Yeah. I made sure I add the charges so it's not confusing. Yeah, potassium is a positive ion. So once it leaves, it makes the inside of the cell less positive. Okay? So basically, this was resting membrane potential. We got a stimulus. We went up, we met threshold. Once we meet threshold, our fast sodium channels are gonna open. You're gonna get this really fast depolarization, followed by a really short repolarization caused by the transient potassium channel. Make sense so far? Okay. Next up, we're gonna have our calcium and our potassium channels. our calcium channel is going to open and it's going to let a bunch of calcium inside. And our potassium is also going to leave the cell. So you kind of have a balance. You have positive charges coming in, you have positive charges coming out. What's this going to cause? They're more or less almost the same. This is going to cause a depolarization, or exactly, it's going to cause a plateau. Basically, this more or less, exactly, they're at equilibrium, so you have no net change in your potential. So it's a straight line. That's it. It's more or less just flat. Okay? At this point, the calcium and potassium are fighting against each other, but then our calcium channels just close. And all you have left is your potassium channels. You have your potassium leaving through delayed rectifier channels and through the leak channels. What's this? Spoiler alert. Anyway, what's that gonna cause? Repolarization. Exactly, negative. It's gonna go down. If it goes below resting potential, that's what we call hyperpolarization. Okay? And then up next, we have our NAK ATPase on our leak potassium current channel. What did we call this last time? Where did we last see this? Was it here or here or here? Why the last repolarization happens? Because, okay, from this point, let me draw. From this point onwards, all the way till here, you have potassium leaving the cell. So you have a negative charge. However, at this point in specific, you're going to have Ca going into the cell. Okay? This Ca entering the cell is going to counteract the work of potassium. So this is why you end up with a plateau. But then once your calcium stops coming in, you're going to have the unopposed potassium again. Yes. Exactly. Depolarization is when it goes upwards, it becomes more positive. Repolarization is when it goes down, becomes more negative. And hyperpolarization is when it goes below resting potential, so about negative 90 millivolts. And to the one that was asking the repolarization, yes. For potassium, you have 1, 2, 3 channels. Each one of them opens at a different point. This one over here is your ITO. It opens and it closes for a short period of time. But then you also have your delayed rectifier channels. So you have other potassium channels that open later on and just continue the repolarization. Basically, if you did not have calcium, then your entire potential would just look like this. You would not have this plateau. This plateau is because of calcium. Okay? No worries. Does anyone have any questions regarding the action potential so far? This is really important for this year, your next block, and the upcoming ones. We're going to actually get to that. That's our very next point, the calcium in the cell. Is everyone comfortable with this concept? Can we move on? Yes, okay. Now, just a quick review. The blue part, it was called resting potential. What caused this resting potential? What channels? NAK ATPase. But then NAK ATPase is found in most of your cells. But the specific one that causes this negative resting potential is your leaky current, or IK. Okay? Your leaky potassium channel is one that causes this negative potential. Okay, this is called phase 4, and it's caused by the leaky potassium efflux. What about this yellow one? What causes this huge spike in membrane potential? Sodium. Sodium efflux or influx? Influx. You have sodium influx through rapid or fast Na channels. What about this short repolarization over here, this transient repolarization? Potassium. This goes through your transient potassium channels. Transient just means for a short period of time, by the way, if you don't know. And then this pink part, why do you have a plateau? Okay, Ca and potassium. If it was just Ca, then you would have a depolarization. But it's Ca and potassium balancing out, so you end up with a plateau. And then lastly, what causes this repolarization? Potassium leaving through your delayed rectifier channels. Is everyone comfortable with this topic? Also, whether you guys were right, I did switch up the concentrations of the ions inside and outside the cell. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay. Do we need to know the exact names of the channels? I don't think she would ask you for them, but if she mentions them in her questions, in her practice questions, maybe. But by the way, they're really easy to memorize. Look, this one's called your fast sodium channel because it opens really fast. This is called your transient potassium. It's ITO. I is because ion. T because it's transient and it opens and closes for such a short period of time. And then O is outwards because you have an efflux or you have potassium exiting the cell. Okay? And then L-type calcium channel. Honestly, you just get used to L-type calcium channel. It's very common, you see in a lot of places. And then delayed rectifier, it's because it's a channel, it's a potassium channel that opens later. It's delayed, and it did not open over here, like your ITO. It opened a bit later, opened around this spot. And then leaky potassium, because you have potassium constantly leaking out the cell. Do the names make sense? Does that make it easier to memorize them? No worries. Okay. Now, one thing about sodium channels, and I mentioned it already, is that they don't just open and close. They open, they inactivate, and they close. Okay? In a resting potential, when the cell is just rested, it's closed. All it needs is a stimulus, and it's gonna open. Do we need to know where the depolarization stops? Like at what number? Um, just know the resting one. The other one isn't important. Also, it changes from book to book. I don't think Dr. Angelica stressed on it in your lecture. The one thing about the maximum depolarization point that you would need to know is that it's higher in a myocyte, and this one's for myocytes, by the way. I think it was plus 30 according to some literature, yes. Is that in myocytes, it's slightly higher than in pacemakers. We're gonna get to that in a bit, but that's quite possibly the only thing you need to know. Okay? Okay, so in your resting state, in the cell's resting state, your sodium channels are rested. They just need a stimulus and they're going to open right up. Okay, so resting is in your negative membrane potential or your resting membrane potential. And then if they go up to threshold, by the way, is the point at which your sodium channels are going to open. Okay, so at threshold, they're going to open. They were closed, they were waiting for a stimulus, and the stimulus is met at threshold, and then they're going to open. And then once you reach a positive membrane potential, which was right here, they're going to inactivate. So until you go back to a negative membrane potential, your sodium channel will not open up. It's inactivated. خلاص. It closed. Okay? Do you get the difference between closed and inactivated? Closed, all it needs is a stimulus. It's going to open. Inactivated, it needs to be repolarized and then it's going to open. Okay. Your sodium channels, it could be closed or it could be open, right? Open is easy. It's open. It's going to let the sodium channels out, the sodium ions out. However, if you're at resting potential, if you're at a negative membrane potential, so let's say about negative 90, the channel is just ready for a stimulus. As soon as you go back up to threshold, which is still negative, by the way, your channel is going to open and sodium's going to leave. Sodium's going to, what's it called, enter. Okay? That's resting. It's closed. All it needs is a stimulus. However, once you're at a positive membrane potential, so once you're all the way up here, the channel is just going to shut. As you can see, it has two gates. It has this one and this one. This gate, once it shuts down, it will not open up until you have a negative membrane potential again. So it's going to close from here. It's going to be inactivated from here all the way up to around here. Okay? Yes. I kind of already gave this away, but at which point is the sodium channel closed? You guys can annotate the screen if you like. From which point to which point is your sodium channel going to be blocked? Inactivated. Not closed, inactivated. Yes. Up to where? Um, okay. Yes, this one. It's between these two, actually. This one. It's just negative. And it's a bit higher than threshold. Okay, you don't need to know the specifics, but yeah, once the cell is in a negative membrane potential. Okay, not fully depolarized. Once it's depolarized, it's inactivated. And then it's reactivated once the cell is repolarized again. Okay? Okay, so at this point, in this dark red box, the sodium channels are inactivated. So there's absolutely no way that you can generate another action potential. خلاص. Absolutely closed off. The cell from here to here will not generate a new action potential until the sodium channel opens. And it's not going to open in these spots. So this is what we call the absolute refractory period. Makes sense. صح? It's very simple. Yes. And then at this point, the sodium channel is open, but you have a really, really big efflux of potassium that's, the cell is really quickly going down. If you were to get it to go back up, you would need a big depolarizing force. This is why it's called relative refractory period. It's possible to generate another action potential, but it's quite hard. And it's a very big, like really, really, really big stimulus. Okay? Does anyone have a question about this part? Or does that make sense? The difference between relative and absolute refractory periods. Okay. Absolute. Yes. Up to this point, they're inactivated. Okay. Okay, yes, you're right. Basically, in your absolute refractory period, no matter what you do, if you inject the cell with a positive ion continuously, you will not generate another action potential. Okay? That's it. Absolute refractory period, you are not getting a new action potential. In the relative refractory period, you can generate another action potential, theoretically, but you would need a really big force. So if you had like a really, really big stimulus that could not only counteract this repolarization, but also cause it to go up, then you can generate another action potential. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if that's what defibrillators do. Defibrillators are going to go into arrhythmias and bigger things that I myself am not sure of, but you can look it up. It could be what defibrillators do. Okay, does anyone have any question regarding the refractory periods? Okay, now, do you guys know what tetany is? I'm sure you've heard about it in your skeletal lectures. What is tetany? It's okay if you don't know it, but if you do know it, what do you know about tetany? Okay, basically, tetany, you see this in skeletal muscles. This muscle is going to start spasming. It's going to contract, it's going to pause, it's going to contract again. It's spasming. Okay, you can look up videos to see what it looks like. The reason it spasms is because you have an action potential build up on an action potential, build up on action potential. It would look a bit like this. Like you have an action potential, and instead of going all the way down, it's going to go back up. It's going to go and then back up, and then back up, and then back up, and just a continuous reactivation, a continuous constant depolarization. It's going to cause the muscle to spasm. It's never going to fully contract and it's not going to relax. It keeps doing this. Okay? Do you guys understand what tetany is? Yes, it's really bad. You do not want tetany. You see tetany with some infections, you see tetany in disorders. It's not something good. Now, how can we prevent tetany in the heart? Or actually, tetany in the heart is very unlikely. But how is that? Could you look at the graph and tell me why you think tetany is much easier sometimes when you wake up in the leg? Do you mean like when you're cramping? That's different. Yeah, it contracts like this. Watch videos online. It's gonna make much more sense. But now I want you guys to look at the action potential of a myocyte and I want you to tell me why you think tetany in the heart is very unlikely. Exactly. You have a refractory period. Now, if you want to compare this to a skeletal muscle, where a where tetany is much more likely. They don't have this plateau phase that we have over here. It goes up and down. And this makes it very prone to tetany. However, in the heart, you have this entire refractory period during which another action potential is not possible. So this is protective. This is good for the heart. At this point, you cannot generate another action potential. You're not going to end up with a spasming. You're not going to end up with tetany. Make sense? Yes. So can someone rephrase what I just said and tell us why you can't have tetany in the heart? Because of the absolute refractory period. Exactly. And what causes this absolute refractory period? Yes, it's the sodium channels, but what causes it to be this long? Like, why isn't the refractory period much shorter, like in skeletal cells? Why is it this long? Because of the plateau. And what causes the plateau? Calcium and potassium. Exactly. So, the difference between your skeletal muscle and your cardiac muscle is that the calcium is going to give your cardiac muscle this plateau phase, and this plateau phase is going to stretch out I'm going to explain again in a sec. Actually, I'm explaining. Basically, in your skeletal muscle, you don't have this plateau phase because you don't have the calcium balancing with potassium. Okay, so this plateau phase is caused by the calcium-potassium balance. Because you have a plateau, this absolute refractory period is extended. Instead of it just being from here to here, like in a skeletal muscle, if it looked like this. I'm sorry, wait, it's not drawing. Like in a skeletal muscle, if your action potential looked like this, your refractory period is just going to be from here to here. Like it's just going to be this part. It's really short because you don't have this plateau. This plateau makes your refractory period longer. So it makes it much harder for another action potential to go on top of this one. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. I thought we also had an absolute refractory period. You do have an absolute refractory period in skeletal muscles, but it's short. That's the problem. It's really short compared to the skeletal one, to the cardiac ones. In the cardiac, this plateau makes the refractory period so much longer. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Now, someone asked what calcium does. This is what calcium does. Basically, remember how we said in the action potential that calcium is going to enter through L-type calcium channels, right? So this calcium is going to enter the cell. It's going to cause depolarization, and it's going to bind to what we call a ryanodine receptor. This is do you remember, do you guys know what the store inside the cell is called? This store would hold calcium. Uh, okay, it's not like vesicle isn't specific. This is your sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's an intracellular calcium store. Okay, in this muscle in specific, and this store is guarded or it's gated by what you call a ryanodine receptor. What this calcium is going to do is it's going to go inside the cell, it's going to cause depolarization, and then it's going to bind to this channel. Once it binds to it, the channel is going to open. Once the channel opens, you're going to have a huge release of calcium. All the intracellular store, all the sarcoplasmic storage of calcium is going to go out. The calcium is going to go to the actin and myosin. It's going to cause contraction. Does that make sense? Do you guys remember how actin and myosin contract using calcium? You don't need to go into details. Yes, yes, you're right. Okay, I'll go into real quick right now. But basically, what induced the opening of the cell? What ion induced the opening of the sorry channel? Calcium. And what was released once the channel opened? Calcium. This is why we call it calcium-induced calcium release. Pretty simple, very straight to the point. Okay? Very simply, the way that you should refer back to your skeletal muscle lecture. Okay, I'll get back to you in a second, Fab. But basically, the way that your skeletal muscle contraction happens, you have your actin and your myosin. This is very not accurate. And the binding sites on your actin are covered by troponin. calcium is going to bind to this troponin, and it's going to cause it to change, and it's going to expose your binding sites. And once this binding site is exposed, your myosin heads are going to be able to attach to it. Does this make sense? Yes. If it doesn't make sense, I suggest you go back to your skeletal lecture, but just know that calcium is what's going to allow your actin and myosin to bind together. Okay? Fahad, you didn't understand. The entire point is that calcium is going to enter the cell through an L-type calcium channel. And once it's here, once it's in the cell is going to become more positive. It's going to cause depolarization. And then the calcium is going to go and it's going to bind to your ryanodine receptor. Your ryanodine receptor or your ryanodine channel is what's going to close off your sarcoplasmic reticulum. Your sarcoplasmic reticulum holds a lot of calcium. So once this calcium ion that came from outside binds to your ryanodine receptor, the receptor or the channel is going to open. Once the channel opens, calcium is free to leave the sarcoplasmic reticulum and go into the cytoplasm or the sarcoplasm. Does that make sense? Yes. So basically, because this opening is induced or caused by calcium, it's called calcium induced. And because calcium is what's being released, it's called calcium release. So calcium induced, calcium release. Make sense? Yes. Okay. Any questions? It's okay. It doesn't. Okay, wait. For the one that's asking about troponin, once I'm done explaining the cardiac, I can go over the troponin real quick in the end. The sarcoplasmic reticulum doesn't close. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is a cavity. Think of it as a vesicle. It's just a container inside the cell, but it's covered. It's closed by. Okay, it's like a room, and then the door to that room is your ryanodine receptor. The door is closed until calcium opens it. Calcium from outside opens it. And then once the door is open, all the calcium inside the room can leave. It is involved in cardiac cells. The reason I didn't go over the actin myosin thing in this lecture is because it's the exact same thing as in your skeletal cells. And it wasn't part of the objectives for this lecture. But if you guys don't get it, I can go over it again near the end of the lecture, once we're done with all the actual objectives. Okay? Is everyone on board so far? Yes. Okay, question time. Exactly. And specifically what ion, essentially, in the long run, is in charge of this plateau and exactly, not sodium. Okay, it is a sodium channel, you're right, but the plateau is caused by the calcium channel. Okay, and potassium. They balance out. Alhamdulillah, everyone's on board. And now we're gonna go on to our pacemaker cells. Once again, this diagram is copy-pasted from the other slide. It's not right. I should have flipped the ions, but malish. I'm sorry, guys. I mixed them up. Now we're gonna be talking about our pacemakers and their action potential. What do you guys know about pacemakers? We talked about this. What's so special about them? What makes them different from myocytes? Guys, why are pacemakers considered pacemakers? Like, what makes them different? Your pacemakers, by the way, are your SA node and your AV node. If that gives you guys a hint. They start the signal, exactly. All of the heart is syncytium. But the thing specific about pacemakers is that they initiate the signal. They initiate the electric current. Do you know what this what this character is called or characteristic? It's called automaticity. The SA node and the AV node can fire on their own. They're automatic. They do not need an external stimulus. Make sense? Yes. Okay. But then why? Why can the SA node and AV node fire on their own? What makes them so different? It's this funny channel right here. It's not really that funny. It's just called funny because it activates axial pull. We're gonna come back to this in a bit. It just activates opposite of every other channel. Basically, at rest, all of your channels are blocked except for your funny channel. Okay? What your funny channel does is it causes a constant depolarization. As you can see here, you have sodium coming in. Obviously, you have potassium leaving, but you have more sodium coming in than potassium leaving. Okay? Is this gonna cause a depolarizing current or a repolarizing current? Depolarizing current. So it's gonna look like this. So once your pacemaker is resting, its action potential is constantly, membrane potential is constantly increasing. Okay, it's constantly depolarizing. And then it's gonna get to threshold. What's gonna happen at threshold? Action potential, exactly. And then what do you see on this graph? What channels are gonna open? And what's gonna cause the action potential to actually start? Okay. See, I wanted you guys to say sodium. In our myocyte, we had sodium. I'm not gonna go back. But in our myocyte, this really quick upstroke was caused by sodium. It was caused by fast sodium channels, right? Yes. However, in our pacemakers, if you see, the resting potential is not that low. It's not -90, it's -60. So the entire time in your pacemaker, your fast channel is inactivated. Your fast sodium channel is inactivated. It's not closed, it's not open, it's inactivated. So your sodium channels don't play a role in this. Okay? Do you guys understand why your sodium channels aren't part of this action potential? Okay. Remember what we said about our sodium channels? Remember how we said they inactivate and then they only reactivate once you get to a really negative membrane potential? Let's say that your sodium channels only reactivate at a membrane potential here or lower. Okay? Your pacemaker actually rests up here. Your pacemaker is never low enough for your sodium channels to open. So your sodium channels are constantly inactivated. So they're not going to play a role in this action potential. That's the next question. What ion causes the depolarization? Take a guess. Take a wild guess. What do you guys think? What if it simulates a large enough CA? Okay, for the one that asked, what if the stimulus is large enough to activate it? I don't get what you're saying, honestly. Like I don't understand what your question is, so if you can rephrase it. But for the actual potential right now, the whole point is you don't have a sodium channel active. Your sodium channel is out of the picture. We're not even gonna think about it. What's gonna cause the depolarization here is your calcium channel. Here, you're gonna have an influx of calcium. What's this gonna cause? More positive? Yeah, it's gonna cause a more positive membrane potential, or in other words, depolarization. Okay? Now, in this case, and I said this before, you're not gonna go as high up as you did in the myocyte because this is calcium, not sodium. Sodium would cause it to go much faster and much higher. Calcium is gonna be a bit slower and it's gonna be a bit lower. Does that make sense? Yes. In a myocyte, the depolarization is caused by sodium. In a pacemaker, it's caused by calcium. And it won't reach as high as it does in the myocyte, no. It will still be positive, like it's still above zero, but it's not as high as a myocyte. It's slightly lower. Okay. Sodium channels are inactive. There's a large enough stimulus. Would they be able to be activated? I'm not sure, honestly. I have not. That's a really good question to ask. I have not thought about that. This is definitely worth looking into. If you can look into it and tell us, that would be great. But I don't know. Like theoretically, I assume it should work, but I've never heard of or read anything that says it does activate it. In a normal situation, it's the depolarization is caused by calcium in a pacemaker. Okay? Is everyone on board so far? Okay. And then up next, you're gonna have your delayed rectifier. Potassium channels are gonna finally come into the picture. You're gonna have potassium leave. You need to know the okay, I'll come back to this question in a bit. Let's finish the action potential first. Okay. So now you're gonna have an influx, or sorry, an efflux of potassium. What's this gonna cause? Repolarization, not depolarization. Your positive ion is leaving the cell, so it's repolarization. So it's going back down. Yes. And then what channel is going to cause the membrane potential to start slowly going back up? No, not the action potential, this part. Your funny channel, exactly. This part where the cell is slowly going back up is called your funny current. Okay, for the one that asked, wait, first, is everyone on board with this? Does everyone understand why the graph looks like this and why the pacemaker is automatic? It does not need an external stimulus. It's not funny. Oh, the funny part on the graph, it's this part. The reason, by the way, the reason it's called a funny current, a funny channel, is just because it opens only in repolarization, whereas everything else opens in depolarization. Or so the scientists like they saw this like, oh, this is funny, so they named it a funny current. But there's nothing funny about it. It's just this current, this upward, we're gonna see exactly on the graph now. But this part, this upstroke, this constant slow upstroke is caused by your funny current. Does everyone understand what's happening so far? Or should I go over it again? Okay. Basically, once in your resting state, in your pacemaker's resting state, it never has a flat part. Like remember, in our myocyte, in its resting state was just a flat straight line. It was just like this, right? This was its resting membrane potential. In a pacemaker, you do not have a resting membrane potential. Your membrane never actually rests. It's always constantly increasing. It's always constantly going up like that. And why does it constantly go up? It keeps going up because of what's called the funny current, where you have 3 sodiums constantly entering and 1 potassium constantly leaving. Yes, automaticity is caused by the funny channel. Okay? The membrane potential is constantly being depolarized by this funny channel. I mean, yeah, I guess that's why it's funny. Why did it drop? Are you asking about this part? Yeah, this part drops because of potassium. Yeah, funny channel causes the funny current. Funny current is just when the ions are flowing. That's called current. Channel is the actual like channel. And the movement of the ions is called the current. Potassium makes it positive, therefore it drops. No. Calcium, okay, funny channel, funny current. Makes it constantly depolarize. Then you're gonna have calcium come in really quick. And that's gonna cause the depolarization. So this is calcium, this is funny current. And then you're gonna have the calcium channel is gonna close and the potassium channel is gonna open. Potassium is gonna leave the cell and it's gonna cause a repolarization. And then once it's repolarized, the potassium channel closes, what's left is the funny current. The funny current is gonna cause the entire thing to start over again. You're gonna go back up, then again calcium, then potassium, then funny current. Okay? Does this make sense? Okay. The one that was asking a threshold reached by the funny current or a stimulus. In a pacemaker, you do not need a stimulus. The funny current is gonna eventually always reach the threshold. In a normal heart, your funny current will always cause the membrane potential to increase until it meets threshold. So you do not need a stimulus. Okay? Okay. Now, okay, this was meant to be a quiz actually. I was meant to ask you guys. Uh, the animation lagged. What causes this part? This depolarization? Calcium. What causes the act like you can't see these, okay? What causes the constant depolarization, the slow upstroke? Funny channels. What causes the repolarization? Potassium. Okay. Yes. Now, one thing about pacemakers is because you don't have a resting membrane potential. Like, we can't call this a resting membrane potential because there is no rest. Instead, we just call it the maximum diastolic potential. Okay? Yes. Okay. Now, I want you guys to notice something. In a pacemaker, we go from phase 0 and we jump to phase 3. What happened to phase 1 and 2? Exactly. They simply don't exist because we don't have the channels that would cause them. Because the plateau phase, which was caused by calcium and potassium, you don't have calcium potassium overlapping. Instead, calcium comes first, then potassium comes. So they're not overlapping, so you don't have a plateau phase. Basically, in your pacemaker, you only have phase 0 and 3 and 4. You do not have phase 1 and 2. They're absent. Okay? Okay. There were two questions. After threshold, do the funny channels inactivate? I think they do. I'm not entirely sure, but I think I read, no, they do inactivate. But I doubt you need to go into that much detail, by the way. You just need to know what channel predominates each phase. Like this phase is predominated by the calcium. This phase is predominated by the delayed potassium rectifier. This phase is predominated by the funny current. That's all you need to know. The details of when exactly each channel opens and when each one closes, you don't need to go into it. I tried to go into it. I was going to take you guys into it, but it got a bit confusing. So I'm like, it's just focus on the predominant channel. Okay? And then someone asked, how does the funny channel reach a threshold? As you can see, the membrane potential is constantly increasing. It's constantly being depolarized because you have this constant influx of positive ions. Okay? You have this constant, like positive ions are constantly coming in, and this is constantly causing the membrane potential to increase. At some point, it's going to increase enough to reach threshold. Once it reaches threshold, your calcium channel is going to open and you're going to spike up. Okay? Okay. Yes, both blue parts are caused by the funny current. Is everyone comfortable with this action potential and everything we've discussed so far? Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Now, this is something that Dr. Angelica had in her slides. I feel like she might ask you guys about this. وأصلا, can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me? Okay, alhamdulillah. This is, as I was saying, this is something that Dr. Angelica mentioned in her slides, and I feel like she might ask you a question about this. So this, inshallah, would be a free mark. We said that the pacemakers of the heart are self-firing. They're automatic. So that means they fire on their own. They do not need an external stimulus. However, I'm sure you've felt it. When you get stressed, you feel like your heart starts racing. صح? Why does your heart start racing? Because your sympathetic system fires up. You go into what's called fight or flight. You're stressed out, your body It's just because your sympathetic system fires. And what this is gonna do is it's gonna essentially regulate or kind of have like an effect on your pacemakers. It's gonna cause them to go faster. Does this make sense? I'll go exactly into how it makes them faster. But the point I need you guys to know really clearly right now is that the SA node does not need, or the AV node, the pacemakers do not need an external stimulus. However, they can be controlled or regulated by an external stimulus, such as your sympathetic or your parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? Is everyone comfortable with this point? Alhamdulillah. Now, if your sympathetic system fires up, what it does, okay, I'm gonna repeat really quickly. We said the entire point of this action potential was to tell you that the pacemaker fires on its own. If you put a heart cell alone without anything, like literally, I think you can look at videos online, they're so cool. If you take a heart cell out of the body, you just have it there, it's gonna keep contracting. If it's a pacemaker cell, it's gonna contract, it's gonna fire. Because it's automatic, it does not need anything around it. It will fire on its own. Does this point make sense so far? Yes. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't regulate it. So you can have something make it go faster. It still fires on its own, but you can make it fire faster, or you can make it fire slower. How do you do that? You can use neurotransmitters, you can use hormones, you can use your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Now, look at this graph, and I want you guys to try and guess what would change to make your heart rate go faster. Feel free to annotate the slide, guys. I think this one's clear. Yeah. What would... Okay, you're onto something, but can you draw it? Or can you tell me what happens? Yes, you're right. Does anyone want to try drawing it? Exactly. Okay, not really a higher peak. That wouldn't make it go faster. What's gonna happen is like Rayan drew. Let me draw it again. Basically, instead of this being this steep, not steep, what's the opposite of steep? This not steep, you're gonna make it a bit more steep. You're gonna reach threshold faster. You're gonna fire faster. You're gonna go down faster. Once again, it's steeper. You're gonna go up faster, go down faster, and all that. Okay, so it makes your funny current thing channel, your funny current slope, or your what phase was this? It was depolarization, but what was the number of this phase? Phase 4, exactly. So what the sympathetic nervous system does is it's gonna make your phase 4 steeper. If it's steeper, it's gonna reach threshold faster and it's gonna cause a faster heart rate. Is everyone comfortable with this point? Yes. Now, your parasympathetic system does the opposite. So how would it do that? It makes your heart rate go down. How does it make your heart rate go down? You can try drawing it on the screen too. Exactly. Yes. It makes it makes the slope decrease, and that makes your heart rate decrease. The height of your action potential doesn't change. Your height stays the same. The only thing that changes is the slope of this thing and how fast you reach threshold and how fast you go back. Does this make sense? Yes. Okay. Alhamdulillah. Now, another point, does the curve shift to the right or to the left? It doesn't really shift. The entire thing is essentially compressed. If it's the sympathetic nervous system, it compresses and so it happens faster. If it's your parasympathetic nervous system, it kind of like expands and it happens slower. Does this point make sense? Okay. And Another thing I want to point out, because Dr. Angelica mentioned it, and I feel like she might ask you about this, is that your sympathetic nervous system affects your SA node, your AV node, and your ventricular tissue conduction, which means it just allows the current to travel faster through your ventricular tissue. Your your parasympathetic only acts on your SA node and AV node. It does not affect your ventricles. Okay? Okay. Now, this, I don't think you guys are going to be asked about this, but she mentioned it in her lecture, and I feel like it's really good to help you just tie everything together. Imagine you have a patient with a transplanted heart. When you transplant the heart, you do not include the nervous supply. So your heart, okay, you have patient A. Patient A has a transplanted heart, which means that his nervous system cannot affect the heart. Firstly, would the heart still be able to beat? It gets its nutrients, it gets its supply, it gets everything. It just doesn't get the autonomic nervous system supply. Yes, it would still be able to beat because it's automatic. Can if this person gets stressed or not stressed, can the sympathetic nervous system, conduction velocity is how fast the current travels through the AV node, through the whatever it is you're talking about. Velocity is speed and conduction is how fast the electric current moves, or like the movement of your electric current. Okay? Okay. Now back to the transplanted heart. So would this patient A's sympathetic nervous system be able to affect the transplanted heart? No. However, if this person gets stressed, their heart rate would still go up. Why is that? Exactly. This is exactly hormones. Your sympathetic, okay, you're not going to get any electric current from your nervous system. However, you're still going to get hormones like norepinephrine. It's still going to go into your bloodstream and to your heart and cause an increase in heart rate. Okay? So a transplanted heart, for example, is not controlled electrically by your sympathetic nervous system. However, it still would be affected by your hormones, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of these. How does the gate open without electric signals? There are electric signals within the heart itself. It just is not coming from the nervous system, from the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So خلاص, everyone gets this point. Is everyone on board? Does anyone have any questions? Okay, alhamdulillah. Now I think I just have a bunch of questions for you guys. Yeah. The answer is, in fact, A. This is a pure recall question, passive recall حتى. Just know that the parasympathetic does not innervate the ventricle. It does not directly affect them. Okay? Okay. Um, okay, what's this? First, do you guys know what end-diastolic volume is? End-diastolic volume, break it down. End-diastolic. So at the end of diastole. So right before, like the ventricle has been relaxed for a while. Now it's gonna contract. So before it contracts, the final volume in it. Basically, end-diastolic volume just means the biggest volume in the ventricle. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. So the answer is B. Does everyone tell me the answer is B? Why to which part? Why the answer is B, or why end-diastolic volume is the highest volume? Because you're gonna stretch sarcomeres. The more you stretch them to a certain point, but in normal physiologic stretch, the more you stretch them, the stronger the contraction. We explained this in the back, like when we first started. It's the optimal stretch. right here. Like if you compare this, which is stretched relative to this, when you have a compression, your actin filaments are going to overlap and you're going to waste some binding spots. Does that make sense? Do you understand why? Yes. Okay. Last one. Exactly. The answer is A. Once again, very easy, active recall, or if you just understand how it works, it's very easy. Um, thank you guys so much for sticking along for this. Inshallah, tomorrow we will upload the yes, inshallah, tomorrow we will upload the smooth muscle recording. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My number's on the first slide. This is a feedback form. It has some questions. So you open the feedback form, you'll get some questions, and then you can give me any comments you have, feedback, criticism, anything you liked, anything you want to change. That's right there. And then I also have right here some relevant YouTube videos. I used these in my first year. They really helped me visualize things and generally grasp all of the concepts. So these are really good. It's like a Google Doc with a bunch of links. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. For the one who asked for the slides, the PowerPoint, the PDF version of this PowerPoint is inshallah going to be available on the drive. It should already be available on the drive. The drive's in your group chat, group description, your WhatsApp group description. After the smooth muscle lecture, inshallah, I'll add the link to the Canva because so you guys can see the animations and all that. But after the smooth muscle lecture is done. And that's it. Thank you so much, guys. Okay, assalamu alaikum again. I'm Salma Nusair, and I'm going to be walking you guys through the smooth muscle electrophysiology now, inshallah. It's a very short lecture, should not take too long, inshallah. Okay, so like we begin every time, we need to discuss the structure. Our smooth muscles, the hallmark shape for smooth muscle is that it's fusiform, which means it starts off thick and then it tapers off near the end. This is what we call a fusiform shape. And much like our cardiac cells, they have a single central nucleus. This is what they look like on histo slides, and this is what the other two types of muscles for comparison. You can kind of see the fusiform shape, but because they're very compressed, it's a bit hard. So I've lined out 2 or 3 of them so you can actually see them right there. You can sort of trace the fusiform shape. That's it, really. You just need to know their fusiform and shape, and each cell has its own single central nucleus. Now, we have 2 different types of smooth muscle cell connections. We can either have a single unit, which like we can classify our smooth muscles into 2 classifications: single unit smooth muscles and our multi-unit smooth muscles. Our single unit smooth muscles, they work together as a functional syncytium, just like in the heart. And if you remember, in the heart, we said that this functional syncytium was possible because of the different channels that we have, the different connections between each cell. So we'd obviously need these connections or similar connections in our smooth muscles to have a functional syncytium. We have gap junctions between each cell, and this allows, much like in our cardiac cell, this allows for ions and just depolarizations to go from one cell to another. We also have desmosomes. These are a mechanical connection just to maintain the strength, like the strong bond between each cell and the other, so that they don't break apart. Essentially, that's it. And the reason you want a single unit smooth muscle is because you want, for example, imagine your stomach. You want the entire stomach to contract as a whole. You don't want like the top part to contract and then the lower part to contract while the middle part isn't. You essentially just want them all to work together and to maintain tone in hollow organs. Your hollow organs are things like your stomach, your intestines, your esophagus, essentially just an organ with a big cavity in the middle. Now, our multi-unit ones each receive their own nerve impulse. This allows this cell to contract on its own without the other ones. And the reason you want a multi-unit is for a quick response to stimulus. Like if this cell receives its own impulse at the same time that this one does, at the same time that this one does, this is a very quick response to the stimulus, rather than having this one receive the stimulus, then the stimulus goes to that one, then to that one, then to that one, you know? So a multi-unit smooth muscle structure is responds much faster to stimuli than a single unit one. This is the one you see in your iris, in your eyes. Now, the way the nervous system actually affects your smooth muscles isn't like in your neuromuscular junction. I have a slide there to show you what your neuromuscular junction looks like. This is essentially, I don't know if you've seen this before, but this is what your neuromuscular junction looks like. You're gonna have the nerve impulse, the very end of your dendrite, of your axon, sorry, it's gonna split into dendrites, right? Each dendrite is gonna have one bulbous enlargement that's gonna release neurotransmitters to the muscle. It's just one enlargement. However, in smooth cells, we have multiple enlargements, and we call them varicosities, these ones. You can see the singular nerve has 1, 2, 3, 4, possibly even more enlargements, and each of these enlargements is going to release its own neurotransmitters. So this means in our single unit, you can see the same exact impulse, the same exact nerve is going to open up here and here and here and here. It's going to allow all of these to contract at the same time. And then the neurotransmitters are going to depolarize this cell, and then this cell's, and then all of the ions and depolarization are going to spread from this cell to that one through gap junctions, and to that one through gap junctions, and so on and so on. However, in our multi-unit cells, they each receive their own nerve, and each nerve has multiple varicosities. As you can see here, the singular nerve has 4 varicosities for a singular cell, which means that this cell can contract on its own without in any way, shape, or form affecting this second cell, and this third cell, and fourth cell, and fifth cell. That's the entire point. The reason you want the varicosities is you have an increased surface area between your nervous system and your smooth muscle cell. You need this singular nerve, like I said, is going to activate this cell and this cell and this cell, and then they're going to diffuse. In the multi-unit one, the singular nerve is going to impact this the singular cell in multiple points. That's more surface area. That's a more like it's a quicker reaction. Essentially, think of it that way. That's it. And then another difference we have in our smooth muscles that we don't see in our cardiac and skeletal muscles is the way our actin and myosin are organized. As you remember, in our skeletal and cardiac muscles, they're organized into sarcomeres, where you have a Z disc, and then from your Z disc, you get your actin filaments, and then between your actin filaments, you have your myosin filaments. This is it's very organized, and they're lined up next to each other and above each other, and that's what gives your skeletal and cardiac muscles their striations. However, in our smooth muscle, they're organized completely differently. Firstly, we don't have a Z disc. We have our dense bodies that are essentially, they do the job of a Z disc, but it's not a Z disc. It's just a singular, like it's one dot, and that's where all the actin is gonna converge into. We also don't have sarcomeres because a sarcomere was an organized unit. We'll see now in a bit how our actin and myosin are not organized in our smooth muscle. We also have, like I said, dense bodies, which are the analogs, analogous to your Z discs in cardiac and smooth muscle and skeletal muscles. We also have longer filaments, and that means, if you remember in our cardiac lecture, we talked about how the more you stretch the cell, the less it can contract, like actively contract. But because we have longer filaments in our smooth muscle, you are able to extend them and like stretch them for a big distance before you actually lose this contact. And lastly, we do not have troponin on our smooth muscle actin. If you remember, in cardiac and smooth muscles, the way you can inhibit cross-bridging or myosin heads binding to your actin is by covering the binding site on actin with something called troponin or tropomyosin. We don't have that in our smooth muscles. We have something else that we're going to talk about in a bit, but just know not have troponin on actin in smooth muscles. Now, the way I told you, it was different, it was organized differently. You have dense bodies all over your smooth muscle cell, and you have actin and myosin connecting each dense body. These are your actins, and then this right here is your myosin. Now, the reason or the difference that this organization does is instead of contracting along the length of the sarcomeres, like let's imagine our sarcomeres were like this, if they were to contract, then the cell would just contract like this. However, if this is how the organization is, our cell's going to contract all over. It's going to essentially just like compress all over like this. Like you can see here, all you're going to do is you're going to bring all your dense bodies closer to each other rather than just compressing it along its length. We're doing this instead all over. I hope this makes sense. We talked about the difference in actin, where you don't have troponin. When it comes to myosin, another difference here is that, remember this bare zone we had in the middle in our cardiac and smooth muscles, and skeletal muscles? We do not have that in our smooth muscle cells. Our myosin covers our myosin heads cover the entire length of the myosin chain, which means that this diagram over here isn't really accurate because this gives you a bare zone, but our smooth muscles do not have this bare zone that ours do. So just to review everything we just said, our smooth muscles are fusiform. They have a central nucleus. They do not have sarcomeres. They don't have organized actin-myosin lines. Instead, our actin and myosin is just all over the cell. And instead of contracting along the length, it's gonna just scrunch over in the middle, just compress like that, like all over, as you saw over here. We also don't have troponin on the actin, so that's not how you prevent cross-bridge cycling. And we also have myosin heads all over the myosin filament. So rather than having this bare zone over here, we just have myosin heads all over. This is not accurate, like I said. This should have heads all over. We also have longer filaments, which means you can stretch the muscle for longer before you lose your active force. That's essentially everything we've talked about so far. Another difference, remember T-tubules in our cardiac and smooth muscles, which allow the passage of a lot of things, one of which is calcium. We don't have that in our smooth muscles. Instead, we have what's called a caveoli, or caveolae for plural. And remember how in our cardiac cell, we talked about how the sarcoplasmic holds a really large amount and concentration of calcium, and that this calcium is the one that leaves and activates the entire excitation contraction, the entire cross-bridging. In our smooth muscle cells, we do not have that well-developed of a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So when it comes to our contraction, we depend mostly on extracellular calcium rather than intracellular ones that come from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I hope that makes sense so far. If anything does not make sense, feel free to reach out. Now, another thing that she talked about, I don't know if it's really high yield, but you mentioned it, so I'm going to talk about it real quick. When we talked about our length tension force before, we explained how we have this bell-shaped curve, but this is talking about the active force. Basically, active force is one that's caused by your actin and myosin pulling each other. This is your active one, and we already explained why it's bell-shaped. However, much like a rubber band, you know how if you extend, how like if you stretch a rubber band, it's going to want to come back, it's going to want to pull back. This is passive force. You are not using ATP, you're not using any actin myosin. It's just an elastic force wanting to pull back. And you have this in all of your cells. All of your cells, both smooth, the three of your smooth and skeletal and cardiac cells have elastic connective tissue, which means they all have this passive force. Okay, this passive force, once again, is not caused by your actin or your myosin. It's simply caused by your connective tissue. Your connective tissue is going to be stretched and it's going to want to come back. That's it. Okay. In your smooth muscles, you have a lot of connective tissue, specifically elastic connective tissue, which means that the more you stretch the smooth muscle, the more it's going to want to come back. You can compare it here to a skeletal muscle where it only starts, let's just look at the numbers. The passive force only starts at like right after 8, which means you have to stretch the skeletal muscle quite a lot before you have a strong like passive force. Whereas in your smooth muscles, your passive force starts much earlier on. All I'm saying right now is that your passive force in your smooth muscles is higher than in your skeletal and cardiac muscles because you have a lot of connective tissue. That's it. Now, remember how we said in our cardiac and smooth and skeletal muscle that we have troponin, tropomyosin, all that to prevent the binding of actin to myosin, myosin to actin. In smooth muscles, we have something else. We have the whole, instead of inhibiting the binding spot or covering the binding spot on actin, we're covering the binding spot on the myosin head itself. So this is where the myosin head, this little light purple spot, is where your myosin head's going to attach to your actin. And as you can see, the tail of the myosin itself is going to cover the binding spot. So how do we activate that? This is also activated by calcium, just like in our cardiac and skeletal cells, but it's a different mechanism. You start off with calcium binding to calmodulin. Your calmodulin is initially inactivated, but once calcium binds to it, it activates. Now, you're going to have a complex. Your calcium calmodulin complex is going to go over to your MLCK, and it's going to activate it. MLCK is myosin light chain kinase. Now, as you know, kinase is going to phosphorylate. So what is your myosin light chain kinase going to phosphorylate or add a potassium, add a P2? It's going to add that to your myosin light chain, which is right here. It's going to go and it's going to attach phosphate to your head. Now, once you add to your light chain in specific, you have to remember myosin light chain kinase is going to add it to the light chain of the myosin. It's very easy to remember. What this is going to do is it's going to cause a conformational change in your myosin, which means it's just going to change shape, and the tail is going to move off and expose the binding site. Now that your binding site is exposed, you are ready to form a cross-bridge cycle, which means you're ready for the myosin and actin to bind together. Okay, so basically, your actin, in your cardiac and your skeletal muscle cells, the way you prevent cross-bridging from happening, the way you prevent your actin and myosin from binding together is you block the binding site on the actin. Okay? And there's a whole cycle on how you expose that. That's different. We're not going to talk about this in this lecture. For your smooth muscle, you prevent it on your myosin head instead of preventing it on your actin. So the binding spot on your myosin head is covered. How do you uncover this? You activate calmodulin by binding calcium to it. Then your calcium calmodulin is going to go and activate your MLCK. Your MLCK is going to go phosphorylate, which means it's just going to add a phosphate to the light chain on your myosin. What this is going to do is it's going to uncover the binding spot on myosin, and this is going to allow your myosin and your actin to bind. Now, this is where the rest of this is the same. Your actin and your myosin bind. You're going to have a power stroke. You're going to have all of that, the actual cycle after the cross-bridge cycle. It's the same in your cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle cells. And your doctor specifically said she isn't going to ask you about this. You just need to know that the regulation is different. Here, you're preventing in smooth muscle, you're covering the myosin. In skeletal and cardiac, you're covering the actin. That's it. Now, how do you undo this entire thing? You have MSCP, a phosphatase, myosin light chain phosphatase. Now, I'm not sure you know, but phosphatases and kinases work against each other. Kinase adds a phosphate. A phosphatase removes the phosphate. Okay, now I watched a video once in first year that said the PE in phosphatase is actually Pac-Man, and that helped me memorize it. I linked that video there's a QR in the end, and I added that video there because it was a really good video. But anyway, essentially your MLCP is going to be like Pac-Man, and it's going to take the phosphate off of your myosin light chain. What this is going to do, once you remove the phosphate, what's going to happen? You're going to get the exact same conformational change, and you're going to cover the binding spot, which means you cannot form another connection. So all in all, your MLCK is going to allow the binding of myosin to actin. Your MLCP is going to prevent that. Okay? Now, as you know, or as you can tell, your MLCK is activated with the presence of calcium. So if you did not have calcium, you would not be able to activate calmodulin, which means you would not be able to activate your MLCK, which means you won't be able to phosphorylate your myosin. So for you to be able to phosphorylate your myosin, you need calcium. However, your MLCP, your Pac-Man, does not need calcium, so it's always active. So the entire story is, once you have calcium, MLCK is activated, and its activity is upregulated, and that's going to dominate over the MLCP activity. MLCP is always there, it's always running in the background, but once you have MLCK is just going to cover up MLCP's work. But once MLCK is not there, because you don't have calcium, you're going to have MLCP's work, which is going to dephosphorylate the phosphate from the myosin head, which means it's going to cover it up, and you're not going to be able to form the bond. I really hope that makes sense so far. Now, she talked a bit about how your calcium comes and how it leaves. Your calcium enters when you have a stimulus. And depending on what your stimulus is, you're going to open different gates. If you stretch the cell, and that's going to open up a gate, this is called a mechanical channel or a mechanically gated channel. If your channel responds to nervous system impulses, it's called a voltage-gated channel. If your channel responds to hormones, it's called a ligand-gated channel. I doubt you'd ask about this. This is just basic physiology, but just know that stretch is going to obviously cause a mechanical change, which is going to open a mechanically gated channel. Nervous system impulses are going to change the voltage, which is why they're going to open voltage-gated channels. And hormones are ligands, so they're going to open ligand-gated channels. And she also talked about how calcium can leave your cell. How after you're done with the cross-bridge cycle, you need to get rid of the calcium. So you deactivate MLCK, and so you have the activity of MLCP. How does calcium leave? It can either go through a sodium-calcium antiport, or it can go back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum through a calcium ATPase, or it can just leave the cell through a calcium ATPase. I don't think any of this is high yield, but she mentioned it, so I included it for just inclusivity. And now you need to know that you have different types of smooth muscle cells. We already talked about one classification, which is single unit or multi-unit, but we also have, depending on how much they contract. Much like our other cells, if you have a smooth muscle that's normally relaxed and it contracts randomly and comes back to its resting state, this is just called a normally relaxed cell. This is the one you see in your urinary bladder or your esophagus. You have some cells that are phasically active, which means that they relax and then they contract, and then they relax and they contract. They just keep doing this, just like that. And this is seen in your stomach intestines, which means your intestines are just going to contract, then relax, then contract, and then relax. So it's just on and on and on and on. You have ones that are normally partially contracted. So you have the cell, it's not fully contracted, but it's not fully relaxed. And you see this in your blood vessels or your airways. And the reason you want this is because your blood vessels they hold your blood in. Okay, I think I'm not going to go into detail about this, but just know that your blood vessels are not too relaxed, because if they're too relaxed, it's going to cause your blood pressure to drop, and it's going to cause a whole other, like a million other problems. But if it's too constricted, like if it's constantly closed, then you're obviously not going to have blood flow. So your blood vessels are partially contracted. And then you have some cells that are always contracted, and you see this in your sphincters. Like for example, there's a sphincter between your esophagus and your stomach. The sphincter is always closed. Sphincters are there to always be closed. They only open for a short period of time to allow passage, and then they close again. So these are your sphincters. The whole point of this is just you need to know that some smooth muscles are normally relaxed, others are normally contracted, and then you have what's in between, which is phasic, it opens and it closes, and you have partially closed. It's just always like this. Yeah, that's it. Now, our sphincters, how do they stay closed? There's multiple theories, but one of them is that you have MSCP is going to come and remove the phosphate while your myosin head is still attached to your actin. So it's already being contracted, and you remove the phosphate while the cell is still contracted. This means that you are now not able to cause a relaxation. So for a while, you're just going to be contracted. And this is called the latch mechanism, or the latch bridge. This connection right here is called the latch bridge. All you need to know about this is that you have a constant contraction, and you do not need ATP for this constant contraction. And you see this in sphincters. That's it. And she added that, so I'm just gonna cover it real quick. The way it looks like, the way your force looks like in a latch muscle, is you have a relaxed phase, then you're gonna quickly contract. So the muscle is relaxed, and then you're gonna get the stimulus, it's gonna contract, and then it's gonna stay contracted for a long while, and then it's gonna relax. This is for a long while, then relax again. And then once again, stimulus is gonna contract, stay contracted, then relax. That's it. When would it relax? When it wants to allow the passage. So for example, your esophageal sphincter is going to relax once you eat food. Once the food gets to the end of your esophagus, it's going to obviously sphincters need to open. It's going to need to open to allow the food to go into your stomach. And now lastly, the action potential in your smooth muscle looks a lot like your pacemakers, but not all smooth muscles. Some of your smooth muscles are automatic, which means that they can have an action potential on their own without needing external stimulus. Why can they do that? Because they have a slow sodium influx. That's it. That's all you need to know. Some smooth muscles are automatic. They can contract on their own without needing an external stimulus. And this is it, honestly, for your lecture. There isn't really much you need to know about this. Just know that smooth muscle cells are fusiform. Some of them are automatic, which means that they can contract on their own. Some of them they have what's called a latch bridge, which means that they can stay contracted for a while. And these are your sphincters. You have single unit, multi-unit cells. Single unit act as a whole syncytium, as a functional syncytium. Multi-unit each one acts individually, so they can respond faster to stimuli. And what else? There really isn't much high yield content in this lecture, in all honesty. I'd say the most important thing about this lecture is to know how the calcium calmodulin thing works, because this is quite different from your skeletal and cardiac muscles. This is quite possibly the most important thing in this lecture. I'm going to repeat it just in case someone didn't get it. If you got it, then khalas, the lecture is done. But I'm going to repeat it right now. You're going to have calcium, it's going to bind to your calmodulin, and it's going to activate it. Now you have a complex, calcium calmodulin complex. Your calcium calmodulin complex is going to go and it's going to activate your MLCK. Your MLCK is your myosin light chain kinase. And what it does is it phosphorylates something, because that's what kinases do. Your MLCK is going to go and phosphorylate your myosin light chain. Once you phosphorylate your myosin light chain, you're going to expose the binding spot that's on the head. So initially in a resting state, this is your myosin head. This is where it binds to actin. And your myosin tail is going to cover the binding spot. Once you phosphorylate it, this tail is going to go away. You're going to expose the binding spot, and your myosin head is now able to bind to actin. That's it. Once you're done with all the cross bridges, MSCP is going to come, and it's going to just dephosphorate. It's going to remove the phosphate, and that's going to just cover the binding spot again. So far, so good. That's it. This is quite possibly the most important thing that you need to know for this lecture. Everything else isn't really as important. Just know that your smooth muscles can withstand a longer stretch before they can't cause an active force because they have longer filaments. And also, the properties. You know, your smooth muscles some of them are automatic, which means they can fire on their own. Some of them have plasticity, which means that they can be stretched out for a long period of time and they'll still be able to contract. Like your bladder, for example, your bladder can stretch out for hours and still be able to contract normally. The uterus can stretch for 9 months. It can just stretch out, and then once everything's done, it can contract normally. This is called plasticity, and it's obviously excitable because it can respond to a stimulus. Like if you get a nervous system impulse, it's gonna nervous system stimulus. The cell's gonna respond to that. That's excitability, and contractility because it can contract and relax. This is honestly it for that lecture. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. My number is in the beginning of the slide. This is the feedback form. Also has some questions that you guys can use. This is the link I was talking to you about. This has a bunch of YouTube videos that I watched in my first year and they really helped me out. Feel free, I genuinely highly suggest you guys watch them. And this is the link to the Canvas slides I am currently using because they have animations. So in case you want to go through the animations, this is how you can access the slides. And that's it. Thank you so much.